Of the first few weeks in the Metaverse Psychiatric Institute, I remember very little. Of how I ended up there, even less. I spent much of my time restrained and heavily sedated, but what I do remember of my diminished world are the doctors. I remember them studying my arms with flashlights and scalpels, but I recall none of the pain. I had ripped the headset from my face and I had been freed from my digital shackles, but the VR gloves would not come off as smoothly. The gloves had not only fused to my skin, they had spread out my arms in slick white tendrils of plastic. I knew something was terribly wrong with my body, but I was far too tranquilized for a proper assessment. Even the slight discomfort from looking at my malformed arms was drowned out by a simple primal pleasure. I was awake. I was awake and in the world of flesh and bone, and when I was awake, Professor Egghead couldn't do anything to me. Of my waking days, I only remember vague impressions. It is the memories of the dreams that I recall with burning intensity. Be it because of the medication, or be it the sheer stress of insanity, the fevered dreams always came to me in disturbing sharpness. Every night I would find myself running like a wounded animal through a forest of dead trees. The start of the dream would always be dim, and I would stumble through the wood with nothing but the crackling of twigs for company. Then, the silence of the forest would be broken by an air raid siren. Each time I slept, the siren would howl earlier and earlier until there was no silence preceding it. Slowly, as the pained song started to loosen its pitch, the sky would light up. With the faint blue light at my back, my legs would stumble less, yet the illumination heralded something much more terrible than a fall. It was the same light that I had witnessed in the original simulation. It was crawling towards me through the forest, threatening to seize me once more. The closer the crawling wall of blue got to me, the more I could smell the foul stench of rotten eggs and phosphorus. Once the light would get close enough to paint my shadow in front of me and the air became unbreathable, I would hear the voice of my tormentor. Shrill and furious, the Egghead would scream. He would screech about how no one could escape his company. As dazed as I was, I did my best to stay awake. The shorter the dreams were, the shorter my mad sprint from the Egghead and his wall of light was. I feared that if my unconsciousness was ever pushed past the nap, I would end up ensnared into the Egghead's nightmare's foreign realm once more. Soon enough, my fear was brought to the test. On the third day of my stay in the Metaverse Psychiatric Institute, a well-dressed man with sharp features and gold-rimmed glasses stepped into my cell. My mind was far too sluggish to make sense of his words immediately, and it wasn't until well after he left that I understood what I had agreed to. I was to be taken to another medical facility. Apparently my employer was gracious enough to pay for surgery to repair my work-related injury caused by disobeying protocol. The surgery would take place under anesthetic. The realization that I was going to be made forcefully unconscious provoked a primal scream out of my throat. When an orderly came to threaten me with a tranquilizer, I tried to turn my wails into words and explain why I had to stay awake at all costs, but my frenzied speech fell on deaf ears. Instead of receiving further sedatives, I went quiet and selected to preserve my energy. For 2 days, battling the tranquilizers that the doctors administered me, I attempted to stay awake. There's no certainty about whether my sleeplessness helped, yet with utter desperation, I hoped that depriving myself of rest in the flesh and bone world would help me regain strength in the place where my dreams took me. When I finally slipped into the realm of sleep from the operating table, I found myself strong. That strength didn't last. The terrible note of the air raid siren dropped much faster than it ever did, and the curtain of blue light closed in with a burst of speed, but I ran. I ran from the horrible voice that stank of phosphorus. I ran through the muddy woods to survive. Not once did my feet stumble over a branch or stone, but the run quickly took its toll. Deep inside I knew that if the blue light caught up with me, I would be sucked back into the terrible world where the Eggman reigned supreme. With understanding came a surge of adrenaline that drove me forward, but the run dragged on for far too long. Each and every part of my being burnt and turned heavy, and my thoughts simmered to those of an animal rather than a man, yet just when it felt like my legs would go limp, a flash of light brought me back to reality. I was back in a Messianic Psychiatric Institute. The surgery had left its mark. For the first day, I couldn't even look at them. They reminded me far too much of the cartoon appendages I had back in the virtual realm. It wasn't until dinner was shoved in through the slot in my cell that I was forced to interact with my new hands. Nailless and poreless and without lines on the palms. I could move my fingers and I could hold a fork, but my sense of touch came as if it was muffled through a thick coating of wool. There were no mirrors in my room, but from the reflection in my dinner bowl, I could salvage a funhouse mirror image of my broken face. The scars around my eyes had not healed well. Combined with the discolored digits that were now my hands, I looked like a monster. The dreams did not stop, but the chase was never as bad as it was during the surgery. Over the following weeks, I came to learn that I was retrieved from my house after a neighbor made a noise complaint. My cries for help were actually answered, yet instead of someone who could free me from my virtual shackles, I got the Metropolitan Police. Judging by my state and by the states of the apartment, I was deemed to be of danger to myself and my surroundings. I was restrained and brought into the Messianic Institute. After police statements and reports of erratic behavior in the workplace, the state decided I should be interred until my mental condition stabilizes. All of this information came to me as brief interludes between the pressure of impending nightmares. The life I lived inside of the Messianic Psychiatric Institute seemed like a vague shadow cast by the ever-present wild dash of my dreams. I was taught breathing exercises and taken to talk therapy and was prescribed pills which I would hide under my tongue. Nothing helped. Everything in the flesh and bone world filtered through as brief moments of respite between those horrible chases in the forest. The night ceased to be countable, and the little that I understood from the doctor's speech dampened into Latin through pure exhaustion of the soul. I was physically present in the world of flesh and bone, but my true being was still stuck somewhere else, in some incomprehensible dimension dreamed up by a fevered mind. For the first few weeks of my stay at the Messianic Psychiatric Institute, I was a man wholly untethered from reality. Yet it's within the confines of the hospital that I found a metaphysical lifeline. Along with the breathing exercises and my psychotherapy and other clinical solutions to my problems of the soul, the state mandated I take part in compulsory hippotherapy. I thought nothing of the practice, not comprehending how spending time with a horse could help me forget the egghead. Yet the moment I was introduced to the therapy animal, my hopelessness quickly faded away. There was something about that horse, something unnameable that dragged me back to the world I knew before I entered the egghead's nightmare. Perhaps it was the steed's mammoth body, or its heavy breaths that tethered me back to the world of the real. Perhaps it were his gentle eyes that seemed to comprehend my suffering in a way that no one else did. Whatever the reason, there was something magical about that horse, and whatever the nature of that magic was, it made my return to the world of the real much easier. The breathing exercises suddenly start to make sense. Meaning started to sliver into the moments of my talk therapy. Suddenly, I found myself to no longer be a mere visitor to the non-digital world, but a man grasping for the ever-approaching sense of belonging in the realm of the real. The doctor still insisted that all my stories of the egghead and the virtual shackles that he once trapped me in were a pure fabulation. Such a feat, according to them, was technologically impossible. A much more reasonable explanation, an explanation heavily supported by my work supervisor who I never heard of, was that I simply had a nervous breakdown and constructed the entire tortured episode through my untethered psyche. At first, I resisted these assertions, but all denial of the egghead's non-existence simply resulted in higher dosages of tranquilizers. The situation felt horribly unfair, and it seemed nigh impossible to reject the undeniable suffering I had gone through. Yet I found solace during my hippotherapy sessions. The horse understood my suffering, but he also knew a truth that had not yet properly dawned on me. The world was unfair, and sometimes, for our freedom, we would have to lie. As I rode the horse, the words slowly crept into my brain. Attached to that lesson that would help me earn my freedom, there was something else. A quiet and familiar murmur. The words were muffled and incomprehensible, but the voice lingered on the edge of recognition. The murmurs would sneak into my skull with no pattern or regularity, and after a couple attempts to describe them to my therapist, I gave up on exploring them. I simply considered them to be background psychic noise that was making it more difficult to escape the caretakers of the state. I also decided to abandon my insistence that my time spent with the Egghead wasn't a byproduct of my imagination. My arms and face bore the signs of my exhibition, and deep inside I knew that the terror I had experienced was no lie, yet eventually I found myself agreeing with my therapist. Every day I lied about the existence of the Egghead, and eventually I found it easier to believe that lie than to deal with the cognitive dissonance. The notion of Professor Egghead quickly disappeared from my waking life. The horse not only tethered me to the waking world, but after a couple sessions of the hypnotherapy, I found a realm to which my dreams took me calmer too. I would still find myself in the same forest of dead wood each night, but after each therapy session with the horse, I would find myself stronger and faster than I was the night prior. With a quick burst of speed at the start of the dream, I could delay the siren. Little by little, dream by dream, that gap of silence grew until one night the siren didn't sound at all. Each time I fell asleep, I ran. I ran and I breathed the way the doctors told me to, and if I ever got lonely, I would imagine the horse galloping next to me. He was perfect company. The first month passed by quickly, and the next 2 even quicker. The horse, the breathing exercises, the sort of peace and quiet that only a sanatorium can provide, it all helped me heal. Occasionally, the odd mumbled voice would sneak back into the nether regions of my skull, and I still felt shivers from catching the occasional glimpse of my reflection, but my stay at the Messianic Psychiatric Institute had served its purpose. I was fit to return to society. My doctors agreed, and, eventually, so did the state. I was scheduled to be released in the morning, and I had anticipated my night to be taken up by dreams, yet in the darkness I was woken by a security guard. He told me that the management had wanted me out early. Bleary-eyed and confused, I was ushered out of my room and given a fresh pair of clothes to change into. I did so under the flashlight of the guard, for he refused to turn on any of the lights. When I finally dressed, I was handed a duffel bag of my possessions, a bus ticket and directions to the nearest bus station. Just past the nearby field. Would be hard to miss. For weeks, I was counting down to the moment I would be allowed to leave the confines of the sanatorium, but I never expected to do so under the cover of night. The gates of the institute provided an island of harsh light, and twinkling off in the distance, I could see the fluorescence of the bus station. The rest of the world was hidden in a starless night. Inside of the duffel bag, I found some hospital-issued toiletries and the clothes I had been wearing when I was first brought in. The shirt and the sweatpants had mercifully been washed, but the cola stains remained soaked into the cloth. Seeing a memory of that terrible time, I found myself uneasy, but it wasn't until I reached deeper into the bag that I had to stifle a scream. Contained within transparent Ziploc bags, there were 2 other items of apparel I had entered the sanatorium with: the headset and the gloves. I was still half asleep and not completely sure about what had transpired, but I knew I had to keep moving to stay sane. Plunging into the darkness didn't help me forget about that tortured reality in the virtual world, and as I moved toward the far-off light of the bus station, the murmur in the back of my skull strengthened enough to make my teeth jitter. The words were still far too muffled to make out, but there was clearly a message being repeated over and over. Without my consent, my mind started to focus onto the murmur. In the darkness, the mumble would slowly sharpen into words. I found myself thinking about Simon and Sally and Professor Egghead. With a deep breath, I forced those thoughts out. If I wanted to conserve my relative sanity, there were certain subjects that I just shouldn't allow my mind to touch. To calm myself, I sat down by the side of the road and practiced one of the mindfulness exercises the doctors had taught me. The bus station was still just a shining box on the horizon, but the sun was far from the sky. I had time to kill, and I spent that time experiencing the world as it came. I focused on the gentle summer wind, on the far-off sound of early birds searching for that elusive worm, on the dew-filled grass my legs were spread out on. I focused and I breathed, and once my mind had calmed enough, I got up and continued my march through the darkness. When a bus station on the horizon grew bigger than my fist, the murmurs started to rumble in my skull once more. I drowned them out by listing off all the things I was grateful for. Chief among them was my freedom. The bus stop was just what one would expect from a rural station near a mental asylum. Small, covered in graffiti, and not particularly informative in a timetable department. The station was remote, and the first rays of sun were just starting to shine through the far-off hills, yet the station wasn't empty. Pale in the fluorescent lights sat a curly-haired man in an ill-fitting suit. "There you are," he said, in a tone of a long-lost friend. "Was getting worried they'd keep you locked up for another couple of months." I'd grown unaccustomed to conversation with strangers during my stay in the sanatorium. It took some effort to force out the words. "Who are you?" "A middleman," he said, brushing the sizable pile of cigarette butts beneath the bench with his muddy loafers. "Your old employer sent me to make sure you were doing well. Are you doing well, Matthew?" He studied my face. The lack of an immediate answer took all the friendliness from his smile. "You see," he said, lighting up another cigarette, "your old employers can't come around and say sorry. They'd love to, but, lawyer stuff. Wouldn't want to make the situation more complicated. They hope that the additional severance package will smooth out any hard feelings and put the entire matter at rest. Wouldn't want to muck around in the technical issues anymore, would we?" His teeth were still showing, but his eyes had gone completely cold. With a shabby suit, the man gave off the impression of a car salesman who's offering up the choice between a lemon and a bullet. He said nothing else and looked nowhere else. The ember of his cigarette slowly crawled down, building an unstable tower of ash. Without thinking about it, I nodded my head yes. Immediately, the joy leaped back into the man's eyes. "Delightful. No point crying over spilled milk, or overanalyzing the puddle for that matter. I'm sure you'll find your financial reparation satisfactory. Now, Matthew, I do have to ask again. Are you well? No one has to worry about you making a scene. Do they?" I shook my head no. Good. You're young and you seem like a bright fella. I'm sure you'll move on to be right as rain." He tapped the ashy cigarette, took another puff, and then put the smoke out and threw it on the pile of butts beneath the bench. "My employers have a reputation to uphold, and they're not the trusting sorts. You might see me around here and there, but as long as you're not up to anything fishy, you have nothing to worry about. We're all reasonable people here, aren't we?" Against the dark stubble, the stranger's teeth shined like pearls. He got off the bus station bench with a long labored grunt and gripped my shoulder like a touchy uncle. "I'll see you around, Matthew. Stay smart." With a wink and a smile, the man walked out of the bus station and got into a beat-up station wagon that had until then been obscured by the darkness. The overpowering stench of cheap cologne and cigarettes stuck around the bus station long after the car faded off into the darkness. The sun had crawled past the hills enough to become visible, but from what I could decipher from the arrivals board, I still had 3 hours to kill until the first bus to the city would arrive. For a while, the murmurs in the back of my skull started up again, but I busied myself by reading the impassioned poetry of teenagers in possession of spray paint. When the scrawl of love letters and half-baked political ideology lost its charm, I closed my eyes and meditated. The man in the ill-fitting suit was right. My time in the virtual realm was best forgotten. When I reached the city, I learned that the strange man was right in another department as well. The company had indeed been generous with its severance package. Paying off the damage and cleaning fees that my old security deposit didn't cover suddenly became a negligible sum, as did the down payment for a 2-bedroom apartment on a city's outskirts. Barring a family or a particularly expensive hobby, I could live out the rest of my life unemployed and comfortable. I quite enjoyed this forecast of the future. Once I got settled into my new life, I picked up jogging. About 5 minutes away from my apartment, there was a little nature trail filled up with lush forests and man-made reservoirs. At first it seemed absurd to both spend my nights and my days exhausting my body with long-distance runs, but soon enough I found an odd sort of tranquility in my waking life that mirrored my dreams. Most of my life was a calculated jog, but in that movement, in that control, I found a sense of purpose. The duffel bag filled with VR equipment was stashed away in the darkest corner of my wardrobe, and I spent my days trying to shave off seconds from my running times. For a couple of weeks, my life had attained a predictable and calming pattern. But that pattern didn't last. The descent started slowly. One night, I found the air raid siren sneaking back into my calm jogs through the dead dream forest, and then, in my waking life, I found a strange muffled speech swirling back into the indescribable corners of my skull. I did my best to ignore the incomprehensible speech, yet the psychic intrusion was undeniable. Each night, the glowing circle of blue light moved faster, and each day the murmurs grew more distinct. The voice booming in the back of my skull started to attain an eerie familiarity, and that familiarity would not be denied. I tried to jog and meditate the murmurs away. I even took a trek out to the countryside to visit the stables near the Messianic Psychiatric Institute. Yet nothing helped. Day by day, the murmurs that traveled down my spine got louder, and, night by night, my dreams became more chaotic. My brief moment of relative sanity came to an end one crisp Sunday morning. I had gone out for my jog early that day. The forests were completely empty of any joggers or dog walkers, and the air was far too frigid to suggest they would show up anytime soon. Even though the path was clear, I was moving much slower than usual. The persistent worsening of my dreams had made 8 hours of sleep impossible, and the lack of rest pulled the air from my lungs. All I had to keep me company on my jog was the discomforting rumbling in the back of my skull and my pained wheezing. As I reached one of the reservoirs, however, the sound of a diesel pump and loud conversation cut through my psychic torture. Gathered by the edge of the water, wearing matching reflective vests and hard hats, stood a group of men supervising the release of fish into the reservoir. The fish flew out of the nozzle of a massive tanker parked by the edge of the lake, and even though the man operating the machine looked as if he needed help, his colleagues happily chatted and smoked cigarettes with their backs turned to him. The novelty of the sea of scaly bodies being spat out into a foreign world caught my attention for a bit. I even sat down by the edge of the water to take in the sight, but my distraction did not last long. Those murmurs in the back of my skull returned with an unavoidable fervor. With each repetition of the message, the words became clearer and clearer. The voice grew in its eerie familiarity until it could no longer be denied. The key to defeating the Egghead, Simon's words boomed in my skull, is to destroy his source of power. That message, that cursed muffled message that had haunted me for all my days in a world of flesh and bone, it rang out crystal clear as I watched the torrent of fish land in the reservoir. Simon, my friend, the man who had sacrificed himself to help me escape the Egghead's horrid nightmare. He was still alive. He was still alive, and he was speaking to me. I might have escaped, but that did not mean the Egghead was no longer a threat. Other people could end up ensnared as I did. Whatever eldritch code had brought the nightmare into existence could still spread further. Simon urged me to return to the realm of the virtual and defeat the Egghead once and for all. It wasn't until one of the neon-clad workers seized my shoulder that I realized I was screaming. That's how badly I wanted to remain deaf to Simon's plea. It didn't work. By the time I got back to my apartment, I had managed to cast doubt about whether Simon was actually communicating with me. A part of me gripped for that long-held idea that the murmurs were just a quirk of my fractured psyche. Another part of my internal monologue allowed for the acceptance of the familiar voice, but questions its origins. Yet I could not deny the thoughts for long. Deep inside, I knew that Simon, in some form, was still alive and he was trying to communicate with me. I didn't even know Simon's second name, let alone his whereabouts. Luckily, for all the power that my ex-employers held, their company leaked data like a gigantic sieve. After a couple hours of snooping through the dark side of the internet and a quick trip to pick up gift cards, I managed to secure a complete registry of employee names and addresses from a Russian 16-year-old on the dark web. There weren't many Simons. There was only one Simon J. I spent hours staring at his name and address, caught between the realization that it would just be a 5-hour drive to see what had happened to Simon and memories of the man who threatened me in the bus station. All the while, I could hear Simon's message repeat over and over from the base of my spine.
The key to defeating the Egghead is to destroy a source of power. Whatever trapped you in the simulation, whatever trapped me, it needs to be destroyed.
Sleep did not come easy that night, but when I finally found myself back in a forest of dead trees, there was a renewed energy in my strides. The air raid siren still sang, the curtain of shivering lights still followed me, and the Egghead screams about the futility of my sprint were as loud as they had ever been, but I found a renewed strength of spirit in my run. By the time I awoke in my sweat-stained bed, I knew what had to be done. The drive would have taken about 5 hours in a rented car, but I instead took a bus. I feared that registering a vehicle would catch the attention of the middleman who had threatened me in the bus station, yet the question of how my new arms would fare behind the wheel bothered me much more. Instead of a 5-hour drive, I was condemned to an 8-hour bus ride in a machine that was intimately familiar with the previous century. The walk to Simon's address from the bus station wasn't a long one. What did, however, take an eternity was getting into his apartment unit. Simon's name was still present on the mailbox slots, but it was missing from the unit buzzers. There was a single blank spot in the column of doorbells outside of the apartment complex. Presuming that this was, or used to be, Simon's unit, I rang the buzzer intermittently, hoping for a response. I did not get one. I had hoped I would be able to slip past the front door when one of the tenants was leaving, but my face made that prospect impossible. The scars from the cursed headset had healed, but they had not healed well. Paired with my nailless hands and exhausted eyes, I looked like a monster of modern science. No dog walker would let me pass, and one threatened to call the police if I did not leave. It wasn't until a meek pizza delivery boy was buzzed into the apartment that I managed to enter unobstructed. With some help from the mail slots, I tracked down Simon's old apartment to the 4th floor. The door stayed closed, regardless of how much I rang the doorbell or how hard I knocked. My search for the new occupants of Simon's apartment was fruitless, yet my attempts had caught the attention of the occupants of the apartment across the hall. Shifting my finger to the buzzer below Simon's, I decided to search for answers elsewhere. From the other side of the neighbor's door, I heard a sudden jolt, but no answer to my call came. I pressed the buzzer again. I knocked. I pleaded with the person to open the door and talk to me, yet no response came. My nerves got the better of me and I raised my voice in my inquiries, yet making my demands for answers louder didn't improve my results. The mute door stayed silent. Once, one of the upstairs neighbors yelled something about calling the police. I made a hasty retreat. My fruitless search didn't need to end in an arrest. Unable to get a ride back home until the next day, I found a motel nearby the bus station that wasn't particularly strict about visitors withholding personal information. The room was without windows and the sheets smelled of bleach, yet the exhaustion festering behind my eyes brought sleep quickly. That night I ran, just like I did every night. My feet stumbled through the dead forest and the air raid siren rang with a hollow terror. The blue light burned bright behind me. The air filled with the stench of burning matches, and the unhinged ravings of the professor seized my mind. That night I ran, but my dream didn't end with me waking up in a sweat-drenched bed. The slap knocked the sight out of my eyes. "You're pushing your luck, Matthew. The people that hired me are reasonable, but they get antsy when someone messes with their money." A hairy fist tightened around my collar. It smelled of cigarettes and disinfectant. Slowly, ever so slowly, the cramped motel room crept past my threshold of perception. All that existed of him was an imposing silhouette with bleached teeth. "If it was up to me, if my opinion meant anything, you would have been taken care of while you were in the nut house. Lucky for you, I'm just the middleman. Folks up there feel rotten about what happened to you. They took pity. They gave you a chance to live a comfortable life, and instead of being a good little boy who minds his business, you had to go snoop. Another slap. A harder slap. Hit me and rendered the imposing silhouette into static again. Something wet slid its way down my cheek. I wasn't sure if it was blood or tears. You're messing with money, Matthew. And when people mess with money, they get hurt. They get into real bad accidents. They wander off forest trails. They disappear. You get the drift. The shadow's hand raised for another slap, and I impotently fought the grip around my collar to escape it. Yet the hit never came. You're lucky, the man finally said, flashing his bright teeth. You're lucky that my bosses are a bunch of bleeding hearts. They want to feel good about themselves. They want to go to sleep safe and sound knowing that they're the good guys. Good guys don't disappear innocent, do they? They don't. You're right. Are you going to make those bleeding hearts feel bad about themselves, Matthew? I shook my head, getting drips of blood on the bleach-scented covers. Good. The grin of teeth in the night grew even wider. I'll let folks up top know that you've learned your lesson. One last chance, Matthew. You get one last chance. Make the best of it. The mattress cried in a symphony of old wires as the shadow stood up. I'll be seeing you around, Matthew. Sleep never returned that night. I simply lay in my bed, dripping blood from my scars, trying to figure out what happened. Sleep never returned that night, but once my heartbeat had left my ears and the sleepy terror gave way to lucid dread, Simon's message resumed its echo in my skull.
The key to defeating the Egghead,
Simon said, over and over and over again,
is to destroy his source of power.
When the broken skin on my face was still fresh, I was certain that I would never again try to uncover the mystery of what had happened to Simon. For those early hours of the morning, I was sure that I had learned my lesson, that I would never try to tempt fate or the patience of my keepers ever again. Yet as I stood at the bus station awaiting my ride back home, as I listened to Simon's message over and over and over again, I found myself thinking about that duffel bag hiding deep in my closet.
Something is left with you. I need to